Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about recall elections. But do you recall? In 2025, we have a lot of current or recently ceased campaigns for recall elections to be held against various elected officials at the state and local levels. We have yet another one against California Governor Gavin Newsom that is trying to get on the ballot. There are two efforts against Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. A lot of Minnesota State House representatives, in particular, are also subject to recall attempts, and many city councilors, mayors, school board members, and more also potentially face recall elections. A recall election is an election where voters can remove an elected official before their term is normally over. So, in that way, it can be argued as a type of special election because it's inherently irregularly timed. But not every elected official can be potentially recalled, however. The process of recall elections also isn't the same everywhere that they are used, nor is the process for getting a recall election on the ballot in the first place. And recall elections, some have argued, are being increasingly used as partisan and or ideological tools simply because of dislike or even hatred of the elected official being recalled. So, what exactly do recall elections entail? How did we even invent recall elections in the first place? How do they get on the ballot? What are some of the most prominent cases for recalls that we have seen in recent and not so recent memory? What are some of the debates we see about when, where, why, and how we should hold recall elections? All that is on tap for today's podcast. So, let's begin. First of all, what is a recall election? A recall is an election where citizens call for an election for an elected official before their term is up as to whether to kick that official out early. Get out of here. Don't let the door hit you on your way out. Uh, it's inherently irregularly timed, sort of like your normal special election that is meant to fill a vacancy. And sometimes, but not always, there's two parts to it on a ballot. It's, do you want to recall this elected official? And if they are recalled, which of these candidates do you want to succeed them? And in some cases, if a recall is successful, the successor is appointed by somebody, probably the governor, but we're going to get more into that and not too far from now. Uh, there are some similar scenarios that you might have heard, like a recall election, but are not quite the same as a recall. So, in a bunch of other countries, you may have heard the term snap elections, where their chief executive, like the prime minister, calls for a new federal election to try to come up with a new federal or an attempt to either create a majority or to uh, increase their majority before their regularly scheduled elections. I'm not super. I'm not particularly well versed in snap elections. There's also retention elections in the U.S. for some U.S. judges. Elections where voters say yes or no to keeping a judge for another term. But those are regularly scheduled elections. Those are meant to happen every 6, 8, 10, however many years. And 20 states use those for state Supreme Court judges, and 19 states use them for their intermediate appellate and general jurisdiction courts. So retention elections are probably the most similar analog because they ask a similar question of, do you want to keep this judge? But they're not quite the same as a recall election. So how did we even get recall elections in the US in the first place? Well, it goes way, way, way back. In fact, to pre-US history. Early on, it was rarely used, but it can be traced all the way back to colonial times. And the first instance coming from the laws of the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1631. And it also appears in the Massachusetts Charter in 1691. Uh, Recall provisions were also included in the Articles of Confederation. That those were the predecessor to the U.S. Constitution, what the U.S. Constitution would eventually replace. But recalls were never used while we were under the Articles of Confederation. And they actually almost did make it to the U.S. Constitution. Uh, During the Constitutional Convention, a Virginia delegate by the name of Edmund Randolph, he included recall elections as part of his Virginia plan. And the Virginia plan would become one of the major bases, along with the New Jersey plan, to uh, become what we know as the U.S. Constitution. But the recall provision was not ultimately included in that because or the provision for the recall election was ultimately struck down by a motion in the convention from Charles Pinckney to strike out that recall. So it never actually fully made it into the final U.S. Constitution. And the concept of recall elections came up a few more times in the decades after the U.S. Constitution was ratified, but they wouldn't really become popularized until what somebody might say, their modern day iteration that spawned from the progressive era, which was roughly 1890 to 1920. The progressives of that era and the progressives of today, there's some similarities in the ethos, but they're not quite the same thing because they obviously had a lot different or some similar issues of that day, but there were also some that were a lot different. But uh, progressive era was also responsible for the direct election of U.S. senators, whereas prior to that becoming a U.S. amendment, the state legislatures chose our U.S. senators. And then there was also the direct or the income tax. But for recall elections in particular, the progenitor, if you will, that was particularly cited by multiple sources that I used for research was a man by the name of John Randolph Haynes. And he was a California political activist who was a major player in progressive era reforms, uh, but in particular, the recall election. And Los Angeles actually became the first municipality to implement recalls in either 1902 or 1903. I saw a little bit of disagreement with a couple of resources. National Conference of State Legislatures said Los Angeles used it in 1903, and I forget what the other source I just used was. I think it was History News Network said 1902 was when it occurred. But in any case, Los Angeles was the first municipality to implement recalls. And then over time, more and more places would implement recall elections. And some examples of that being that Michigan and Oregon in 1908, they would be the first states to adopt recalls for state level officials, because initially it was just for local level officials, but then it started becoming more common for state level officials. So things like governor or attorney general or secretary of state at the state level. Uh, those or many of those legislators or many more of those government officials or even state legislators or even judges would in some of these states become subject to recall elections. And most recently, New Jersey in 1993 and then Minnesota in 1996, they were the most recent states to adopt recalls for state level officials as well. Speaking of which, who exactly can be recalled? So, local level officials were the first people to really be able to face recalls in at some point in somewhere in the United States, and then it started to become more common for state level officials. Federal officials, however, cannot be recalled. Remember that the U.S. Constitution did not ultimately incorporate a provision for federal recalls like Edmund Randolph would have included in his provision. Some states, though, have argued through their state constitutions and through other legal means that citizens have a right to recall members of Congress. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has yet to directly rule on this, but they have ruled in the past that one, the right to remove a member of Congress resides exclusively with Congress. That's how they expel members of Congress. And number two, individual states cannot unilaterally change the length and number of terms of office for federal officials, which complicates the quest for some people to implement term limits for members of Congress. So 39 states allow recalls for at least some or all local level officials, and then 19 of them allow it for state level officials as well. Possibly a 20th state there, but it's a little unclear. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. But 19 states can definitely remove at least governors through recall. Illinois allows governor and only governor at the state level to be recalled. But the other 18 states also allow all executive state level officials that are not governor to be recalled as well. So things like Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor, if that state has that. If they have a comptroller, Attorney General, things like that. All those 18 states, except for Rhode Island, also allow recalls of state legislators. And then 10 of those states allow for recalls of state level judges. So now for that 20th state, that really iffy one, Virginia is iffy about whether state level officials can be recalled. Why would it be unclear and ambiguous? Why wouldn't it be straightforward as to whether they could be removed? Code of Virginia, Section 24.2-233. Upon petition, a circuit court may remove from office any elected officer or officer who has been appointed to fill an elective office residing within the jurisdiction of the court. So why is that an issue? Well, problem is that the circuit courts only account for a portion of the states. They cover a circuit, while state level officials cover the whole state. So do circuit courts still have jurisdiction over state level officials? That's a little up in the air. Could all of the circuit courts then get involved in the recall of a governor? There's going to need to be either, because it's the Code of Virginia, perhaps the legislature can actually rewrite that law, or voters. I'm not sure what the law is off the top of my head for Virginia when it comes to citizen-initiated ballot measures, but citizens might be able to push forward a ballot measure to get that cleared up as well. So right now, there's no clear-cut answer as to whether Virginia can remove state-level officials in either the executive, legislative, or judicial branches through recall elections. Local officials can definitely be recalled, though, because they would be subject to those circuit court, or those circuit courts, because they'll at least have a specific jurisdiction over those local level officials. And the way Virginia does it is that they actually have those circuit courts review whether they can recall those officials. Not really a recall election like you would see in other places. But as for states overall, when it comes to recalling local level officials, like we said earlier, 39 states allow for recall of local officials, but there are sometimes limits. There often are limits to that. Some states only allow some local level officials to be recalled. Some of those examples in Minnesota, they only allow it for countywide offices. So municipalities are not countywide, so they would not be subject to it. Missouri has a specific designation called a Class 3 city, and then charter cities that also include recall provisions. Those can see recalls as well. So some charter cities might not include recall provisions, and then cities that are not specifically designated as Class 3 in Missouri, that's not necessarily a designation you see in most other states. And then West Virginia also allows for recalls in charter cities. And then recall may also be limited due to home rule provisions. A few episodes ago, I had actually 2 episodes about home rule. So please go ahead and check that out for more about home rule. But home rule is basically the capacity that local governments have to administer their own affairs apart from the involvement of state governments. In such cases where home rule is applicable, states will allow cities and or counties to adopt their own charters that can then provide for a local recall. A charter is basically, you can think of it as like a local government constitution. So a city that has a charter, it's a constitution specifically for that city. Now, those are all the states where you see recall elections. how is the actual process of recall elections? Well, the process for getting recalls on their on that state's ballot, they differ greatly between states. But the general process is basically that citizens had to get a certain number of petition signatures from registered voters of the appropriate jurisdiction. So, for example, if it's a city councilor they're trying to get uh, recalled, it's citizens that are in the jurisdiction of that city councilor. It can't just be anybody in the state. Whereas if it is a statewide official like a governor, then anybody in the state could sign a petition for it. But citizens have to get enough petition signatures, and it's a specific piece of paperwork that you have to fill out saying, yeah, I want to see a recall election for this official. You get enough of those from registered voters in the appropriate jurisdiction. Then you got to get those signatures verified. And I've had to do that for not for a recall election, but I have had to get petition signatures for something before, and boy, it's a pain because you have to get the actual signatures signed or the actual petition signed with real signatures, and then you have to get those signatures verified. And there could be any reason that that signature doesn't get verified. Not necessarily that a lot of them don't get verified, but you can expect something like 5 to 10% of those signatures won't get verified for whatever reason. So enough petition signatures signed, signatures verified, and then the recall question gets put on the ballot. So it's not you get all those petitions and then they say, okay, that guy is that person that's in office right now. Now they're out of here. No, then you get the recall question put on the ballot. Now, beyond that, the ways that states can differ in getting a recall election on the ballot, one way is the petition signatures, the number that they have to get, and what exactly that number is based on. Typically, it can be based on a percentage of votes cast in the last election for that office or a percentage of registered voters at the time of that last election. So if it was Joe Schmo running for that one the governor's race in 2022, and it was based on the percentage of votes cast in that last election, let's say there was 1,000,000 that were cast, and then you needed at least 20% of that number of votes that were cast. That means you need 200,000 signatures to be signed and verified. If it's a percentage of registered voters at the time of that last election, so maybe there was 1,000,000 people that voted, but there were actually 2,000,000 people that were registered to vote at that election, but 50% of them didn't vote for whatever reason, then you need 20% of that 2,000,000, which actually is 400,000. So petition signatures, the number that you need and what that number is based on, that can differ. The length of time that the petitions can be circulated to call for a recall. So if you're running a campaign, maybe you get, depending on what the office is, you might have several months to do it. Maybe you have something like 150 days, 200 days. Or if it's like a really local level office, then you probably have a lot shorter length of time. You might have like 30 days to do it or 45. What also differs is if it's a state official or local official. If it's a local official, you have a lot fewer signatures that you need because the local official has a much smaller electorate than the state official. That governor who had 1,000,000 people vote on him, that local official is probably going to have something more like several thousand or maybe tens of thousands, unless it's like a bigger city, but it's still going to be a lot less than in regards to that governor. And then also the reasons that are considered valid for a recall. Of the 39 states that allow for recalls to some extent, 12 of them have specific grounds that need to be met for that recall election to even be possible. So some grounds are a bit more specific and clear cut, while others are a little bit more ambiguous. There's more specific ones like misfeasance or malfeasance. Misfeasance means you did a lawful act or you were trying to do your duty, but you did it in the wrong way. You mishandled it. Malfeasance means you intentionally did something wrong. You were doing it with malice. So misfeasance, malfeasance. So those are a bit more clear cut as to what they are versus what some states include is a mental lack of fitness. That might sound obvious, but I mean, if you look at Joe Biden and Donald Trump, for example, obviously they're presidents, they can't be recalled, but largely depending on your partisan affiliation, people have considerably different opinions as to whether either one of them or both of them are mentally fit for the presidency. But you can apply that same kind of logic to local or state level officials that can be recalled. What exactly constitutes a mental lack of fitness? In any case, the grounds for recall among these 12 states, it's going to differ, but they may or may not include lack of fitness, incompetence, neglect of duties, corruption, conviction of a felony, moral turpitude. I really enjoy that term. Basically means wickedness or depravity. So moral turpitude, drunkenness, oppression, gross partiality, misuse of funds, and then there are a bunch of other potential grounds for a recall election to happen. Now, you won't see all those in each of those states, but it's in those 12 states that require specific grounds to be met, you're going to at least see some of those. Now, what happens if that official is successfully recalled? So you had that official that was being recalled, you got that election on the ballot, and people say, yeah, we're tired of this person. He's out of here. She's out of here. They're out of here. Whoever it is. What happens if that official is successfully recalled? So there are 4 general methods that you see, forgetting that one unique method of Virginia where circuit courts handle it. There's 4 general methods that you see where what happens after that official is successfully recalled. Sometimes you'll see a simultaneous election where the same ballot asks, do you want this official recalled? And then if this official is recalled, who do you want to take their place? So even if you don't want that official to be recalled, it says, well, just in case that person gets recalled, who do you want to replace them? Other cases, there's a separate special election. So those 2 questions are spaced out. So you have the actual recall election happens and you say you do or you don't want that person to be recalled. Then if they are recalled at a later date, you have that special election that says, okay, now who are we going to replace that person with? Other times there's an appointment where the successor is chosen by a different governmental official, or I don't know why I said government official. Most likely it's going to be the governor, but if it's a local level official, might actually be somebody else. And then there's also automatic replacement. So the succession is chosen by a legal line of succession. So if the governor is removed, it's probably going to be the lieutenant governor that goes in. Unless that state doesn't have a lieutenant governor, then it might be somebody like the secretary of state. And then some states are going to use multiple methods depending on which elected official is removed. So in Alaska, for example, if the state legislature or the state legislator is the one that's recalled, then it's an appointment by the governor. And if it was the governor that was recalled, then it's an automatic replacement. And I'm pretty sure it's just a lieutenant governor that goes in then. California, if it's a state level official, it's a simultaneous election, sort of like what you saw with Gavin Newsom in 2021. Now, he was not successfully recalled, far from it, but on that same ballot, they had, do you want Gavin Newsom to be recalled? And then the second question was, if Gavin Newsom is recalled, who do you want to replace him? And then if it's a local official in California, then an appointment is made instead. Now, who are some of these prominent past and present targets of recall elections? So recalls they're inherently notable because voters were angry enough to kick out or almost kick out an elected official before their term was over. Now, obviously, some recall attempts don't even get close to being on the ballot, but for the ones that do get on the ballot and the ones that successfully do remove an official, that makes it inherently notable to some extent. But some recalls are obviously more impactful and or more prominent than others. Now, historically, local level officials, much more successfully recalled than state officials are, because local level officials have a far lower threshold for petition signatures that need to be gathered to get that recall election on the ballot compared to a state level official. Local jurisdictions only voters in that locality versus statewide, where you have to go all across the state to get petition signatures. And then there's just the sheer number of local officials is much greater than the number of state officials. And there's been a bunch of attempts against governors statewide, though most of them don't get to the ballot. And only 2 governors have been successfully recalled in U.S. history. Way back in 1921, we had Lynn Frazier of North Dakota, though, interestingly enough, only a couple years later, he'd make it to the U.S. Senate, and he'd serve there from 1923 to 1940. So didn't really tank his career, far from it. And then not too long ago, I mean, it'll seem forever ago to some people, and I was only 10 when this happened, but Gray Davis in California in 2003. He was blamed for a state electricity crisis and faltering economy. And that was actually what opened the door for the governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, to become governor of California. But funny enough, he was also the target of a recall campaign, but that failed to make the ballot. That didn't really get that far, but still kind of interesting anyways. But we just talked about him before, multiple times against Gavin Newsom, including the one in 2021 that did get on the ballot, but Newsom easily won. But now there's another petition or recall campaign against Gavin Newsom going on right now. A different governor that actually did come fairly close to getting recalled, Scott Walker of Wisconsin. He also ran for the presidency for the Republican Party in 2012, whereas Gavin Newsom's a Democrat, Scott Walker a Republican. He faced a recall in 2012 that did get to the ballot, but Walker ultimately won with 53.1% of the votes. And I believe that was during his first term. So I think he ran again in 2014 for a regular election, for re-election. And then Evan Meacham in Arizona in 1988, he would have been subjected to a recall, but he was impeached and convicted by the legislature before that happened. So that would have been, in all likelihood, well, he would have been the second governor to have been recalled, more than likely, because that was before Gray Davis did get recalled in 2003 for California. But for state legislature, right now in 2025, we have at least 30 recall campaigns for Minnesota State House Representatives. Right now in Minnesota, the division of power between the Republican and Democratic parties is incredibly tight. It's the thinnest it can be. Republicans have the majority right now. Whether any of those will go anywhere is up in the air, and I don't believe, off the top of my head, I don't believe Minnesota requires a reason for a recall. But there's lots of local officials like mayor, city council, and school boards that have been subject to recalls over the years, especially in recent years. In recent years, common reasons for those recalls of those local officials have included COVID-19 policies and general debates about how to educate pre-K through 12 students. Not always the case, but those are fairly common reasons that you see recall campaigns be waged against them. Not necessarily that they actually get to the ballot, but they at least attempt to get recall elections on the ballot against those officials. And Ballotpedia, to cite some data, Ballotpedia from 2009 to 2024 said that there was an average of 35 recall efforts against an average of 81 school board members per year during that time. And 20% of school board members included in those efforts faced recall elections. So 80% of them, they saw recall attempts, but they didn't make it to the ballot. Some of them might have gotten close. Some of them might not have gotten even remotely close. And then 12% of those school board members were, of the school board members that were subject to recall campaigns, not necessarily elections, but recall campaigns, 12% of them were successfully removed from office. So, as a general overview of how these recall elections work. But now let's get more to the normative thoughts about the philosophical reasonings behind recall elections and when, where, why, and how we should have recall elections, or if we should even have them. Because many recent recall efforts have been criticized as couched primarily in partisanship and ideology as opposed to actual wrongdoing. So, voters, especially in these polarized times that we have, a lot of these recall elections have been accused, not necessarily all of them, and not everybody agrees, but some of them have been seen as, well, you're just doing that because this official is a Republican or this official is a Democrat. This person has conservative policies. This person has liberal policies. But how do you determine definitively which ones are partisan and which ones are ideological and which are quote unquote justified? Such determinations of those can also be biased. Maybe those recall elections are biased in terms of partisanship or ideology, but the people who are criticizing them also have their own partisan or ideological bias against those recalls. But even if they are overly partisan or ideological, does that mean that those recalls should not be used? I was reading, when I was doing research for this, I was reading, it was Marquette University Law School, and they actually had two articles that weren't necessarily arguing completely different things, but one of them said that was actually referring to the Scott Walker recall and saying basically that people in support of Scott Walker were saying that recalls were only designed for officials that were corrupt, whereas the person writing this article was saying that that was false, that recall provisions were never intended to be limited in such fashion. But then there was a different author for Marquette University that said many of the advocates of the recall from the progressive era saw it as a useful tool against corruption. Not necessarily completely diametrically opposed viewpoints, but even in that one resource, it did seem to be at least a little bit of differing views for what recall elections were intended for and what they should be intended for. Well, I guess they weren't necessarily arguing whether they should be used for just for corruption purposes or anything like that. But in any case, even if it is primarily partisan or ideological and it's not based on any criminal wrongdoing, does that mean that these recalls should not be allowed? Uh, is it the organizers of the recall that are being partisan or ideological? Or is it the target of the recall that has been partisan or ideological in how they've handled things? What if both sides are being partisan or ideological? And then, even if we largely agree that an elected official is terrible and they need to get out of there as soon as possible, should we just have to accept that we elected the wrong candidate and suck it up, so to speak? Do we get to have a do-over before the term is up? Or do we have to wait it out and basically say, we messed up, they're just going to have to finish out their term, and then we make a different decision when the next election happens? It's not necessarily a straightforward answer, and obviously there's going to be a lot of different answers for each of those questions. There's also the fact that all elections cost money to administer, and local governments bear the brunt of those costs. It's actually not the states that primarily handle elections. They oversee things, but the ones that are actually administering the elections are the local governments. Now, that doesn't mean that we should not have those recall elections, but you need to keep these costs in mind because elections can get very expensive, especially if you have a statewide one. I believe the one against Gavin Newsom in 2021, I want to say I read that it cost $300 million. I can't remember for sure. Now, California is also a massive state, it's the largest population in the country, but the costs of these elections are something that you have to consider as well. But in any case, even if we were all to agree that, okay, we should have recall elections to some extent, ask ourselves the where, what, where, when, what, why, and how. And the when. Did I say the when? Whatever. The 5 W's and the how. Um, so when should we be able to have these recall elections? Is there such a thing as too close to a regularly scheduled election? What if there was theoretically a recall election that happened 4 months before the regularly scheduled end of a term? So if an election was happening in November 2026, the regular election, but the recall happened in 4 months before, so July 2026, is that too close? Is that kind of a waste of time at that point? Or should it have to be like a year before, at least before the regularly scheduled election happens? So instead of November 2026, it happens in November 2025. And then you got to turn around a year later and have the regularly scheduled election. But then not even just when the recall election should happen. How long should these recall petitions be able to be circulated to get a recall election on the ballot? Earlier, we mentioned that partially depending on whether it's a local level or state level official and how big the state is, and several other factors, you might have more time to circulate petition signatures. So maybe one election has 150 days or 160 days to circulate petitions, whereas another election is 30 to 45 to 60. Which of those is appropriate, and how much does that change depending on what official we're talking about? Now, what about the question of where should we be able to have recall elections? Should we just have them at the local level, or should we be able to have them at the state level as well? And if you do have it at the local level, do we get to have it with any local official? Remember, we have those home rule considerations to think about. Where as to whether home rule cities get to decide, yes, we are going to have recall elections when you don't necessarily normally have recall elections in that state, or the exact opposite way where a state normally allows recall elections, but this one place that has some level of home rule says, actually, we're not going to have recall elections. Which cities and counties get to differ from the rest of the state? So are there home rule exemptions in this regard? Because home rule is not necessarily a clear cut, this city has home rule, this city doesn't have home rule. There's a lot of factors into it, and we go into it more on those couple of episodes. I talk about home rule where they might have more leeway as to how to structure their governments, these local governments. But typically speaking, more fiscal matters like tax rates, they tend to have a lot less. The local governments tend to have a lot less say in what those tax rates are. They usually have to get state government permission. So, where does the provision of recall elections fall in that regard? Because even in states that have some level of home rule, the level of home rule is going to differ from another state. And if we include recall elections at the state level, should we be able to have it for just the executive branch? Do we also include judicial branch? Do we also include the legislative branch? Does recall apply to one, two, or all three of those branches of government? Not necessarily a straightforward answer, because some states don't, or some states allow it for all three branches of government, where some only allow it for two, and then some only allow it for one. So how about why? What reasons should we be able to have recall elections? Should they be for any reason at all? Or would they start to become too frivolous? And even if they necessarily seem frivolous, those campaigns still have to get the requisite number of signatures to get that election on the ballot. So that also gets back to that question of how many petition signatures should a recall campaign have to get a recall election on the ballot, and how long should they be able to circulate those petitions? So, should we have any reason whatsoever? Can it be just because we don't like this person's face? We don't like the way they talk? Yeah, should there be specified reasons instead? Does there need to be an accusation of criminal or civil wrongdoing? So political corruption, misfeasance, malfeasance. Can we include specific policy issues and proposals that they've had? So we don't like how they've handled a city's crime rate, or that they raised taxes, or that uh, we don't like how they handled COVID-19. Whole myriad of reasons. They're now, these reasons are not necessarily going to include a specific policy issue in the laws, where like the laws say, okay, you can have, if it's a state that has a provision for, okay, you need to meet these specific grounds. It's not going to say like, oh, well, the policies that you're allowed to address are these. No, but should we have restrictions on that? Are some issues more important than others in that regard? Um, is the economic record a justifiable reason? Because economics, a lot of people are involved. It's very easy for us to look at one person and say they're specifically the problem, but again, that can be couched in partisan and ideological biases. Um, or is there a level of conduct unbecoming of an elected official that should be considered? So if they're generally just a jerkwad, is that good enough to try to hold a recall against them, or to circulate petitions to have a recall election against that person? Even if we do have specific reasons, are those really just cover for partisan and or ideological reasons? And even if it is a cover for those, does it matter? Is it like how I cited that Marquette University Law School two different articles? One said, oh, no, it shouldn't be for, recalls weren't intended for any specific reason. They were just intended for anything, for any reason that voters thought that they should be recalled. Whereas another one said the people who originally, the progressive reformers who originally popularized recall, were doing it in regards to corrupt elected officials. So does it matter if any of those are actually just a cover for partisan or ideological reasons? And then lastly, how should we have recall elections? So we talked about the four general methods earlier. Should it be a simultaneous replacement where, excuse me, where on the same ballot you say, like with the Gavin Newsom 2021 recall election, where you say, do you want this person recalled? Okay, if we do recall this person, who do you want to replace them with? Should we have that at the same time, or should there be a separate special election? So one of the benefits of having the simultaneous election is that you're doing it all at once, so you don't have to have election costs for holding two different elections. So you don't have the one for recalling the elected official and then having another one later that says, okay, who do you want to replace them with? Whereas if you're having that separate special election, you're having to pay for two different elections. But if you have that separate special election, you get to have a certain length of time to think your decision over. Whereas the simultaneous election, you have to take less time to really come to a decision of who you want to replace that person. Not necessarily that one being better than the other. It's just another consideration to consider. Or if we don't, instead of another election by the voters, or the voters get to decide the recall, but maybe they don't necessarily get to be the ones to decide the replacement. Maybe then we should appoint the replacement. Maybe it's the governor that does it, or if it's a local level official that gets recalled, maybe the mayor should do it, or maybe some the county commission should jointly decide who gets to replace that local elected official. Or do we just have an automatic line of succession? So voters don't get to decide, government officials don't get to decide. It's already set in stone, in law, who gets to replace that elected official if they get recalled. And then should courts be involved, like in Virginia's recall system, where the circuit courts basically decide if that person gets recalled? That's a very unique system. Should that be implemented in another state? Or should there be an entirely different system that somebody has not come up with yet. Maybe it should be a combination of all of these. I don't know. Maybe we say, oh, the governor gets to appoint this person, but then the voters get to uh, uh, say whether or not they approve of that governor's choice. Who knows? Just a whole bunch of ideas being thrown out. So there's all these sorts of considerations where even if you agree that we should have recall elections, you need to think about whether or how exactly those are administered. And that's the way with a lot of different political issues. Not necessarily just, okay, we should do it this way, but exactly how do you do it that way? Or you generally fall on one side of the fence of, okay, I support this general thing, but how do we exactly implement it? Always more complicated than a lot of people like to make it out to be. So, are recall elections what we should we have get to have recall elections for everybody? Should they only be allowed for certain people? That's obviously for you to decide. I'm not here to get involved as to whether or not I think that somebody should be recalled. I'm just trying to give as informative of tools as possible for you to decide what you think about recall elections, how they should be handled, and so on. So that's going to do it for today's episode. So as always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Please like, comment, subscribe, share the podcast with your networks, with your friends, with your family, with people you don't like. Maybe you can reach out to somebody and have a truce and say, "Hey, this podcast is really nice. You should listen to it." I mean, obviously, that's wishful thinking, but in any case, please share the podcast with anybody you know, and links in the show notes for my Facebook, LinkedIn, my educational email course about ways we unintentionally further polarize the political climate, even when we're trying to depolarize it, and how we can fix those mistakes. My book on Amazon, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Can Become More Competitive, not arguing for or against independence, just saying a lot of the roadblocks that they face. And couple of other things in there too. My Matchmaker FM profile, if you want to be on this podcast or you want to have me as a guest on your podcast. And I think that's going to do it. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.